Well, welcome to the 10th week. And I'm sorry, it's just the 11th week, I believe. So, anyways, we are basically covering the second half of chapter 7. And if you look on page 454, the very first thing it talks about is two-dimensional arrays. Now, two-dimensional arrays are kind of a unique beast altogether in that think of a spreadsheet. That's probably the best way to think of a two-dimensional array. So we have columns and we have rows. And so what we would do is, if you look, in this case we're creating a double data type, and you notice we have two empty square brackets, and then I've basically given the array name of scores, and it's equal to a new double, and then I've got 3 and 4. So what that is basically saying is I have 3 rows and 4 columns. So in order to utilize this, we'll see this in a second. So let me give you a real life example. I work for an insurance company, and so we need to collect data. So as we're reading data in, we need to put data into its certain categories. So what we'll do is we'll have 2 rows, and one row is going to represent males, second row represent females, and then we'll have columns for age groups. So as we read the data in, we can then categorize them and put them into each one of those different rows and columns depending on their sex and their age group. So that's kind of how a two-dimensional array would be used. So if we go to the next page, we can see that that's how it's explained. So if I need to get the first row, first column, I would say scores 0, 0. If I needed to get the first row, column 2, I would do scores 0, 1, and then 0, 2, 0, 3, so on and so forth. So as you can kind of see how we can get to each one of those different cells, so to speak, by row and by column. So here we have, and this kind of lays it out even more visual. We can see score 0, 0 is this cell, this block of the table, and 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, then 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, so on and so forth. So not too bad, pretty self-explanatory, kind of makes sense. Okay, so let's take a look at corp sales on page 456. And if we take a look at this, here we have a void main, so basically it's an executable method, and I've got 2 constants. I've got one called divs and quarters, so 3 and 4, and I got total sales, which is a double. And then I come in and I say I'm going to create a two-dimensional array. It's going to be a double data type, so I've got my 2 square empty brackets, and I'm going to instantiate it as a new double, and I'm going to instantiate it with divs and quarters. So I'm going to have basically 3 rows and 4 columns. So I've got my scanner keyboard, so I'm going to use my console to type in things in and get things from. And I say this program will calculate the total sales of all company divisions into the following sales data. Now this is where it gets kind of different than what we've seen before. Here we have 2 for loops, one inside of the other one. So here's what you think of. This first for loop is what we're going to call the outer loop. Think of that as the rows. So we're going to basically do row 1, then row 2, then row 3. So inside of row 1, we're going to go through all 4 columns. Okay? So that's basically the inner loop. So we do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we increment the row, go down to the next row, then 1, 2, 3, 4, increment the next row, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So very simplistic. We basically created an integer div is equal to 0, and while the div is less than divs, we will basically increment the div by 1 each time. And then I basically have the 4 int quarter, and while the quarter is less than the constant quarters, we'll increment the quarter by 1 each time we go through. So I say division, and there's basically one of our formatting parameters. quarter, one of our parameters, and $sign. I say div plus 1 and quarter plus 1. And this is where I say sales of the div and the quarter are equal to the keyboard next double. So we're typing in information for each of those sales. And then I do a print line. Okay. Then once we get through with that, we go ahead and do another for loop, one inside of the other, an inner and an outer. And we're going to then basically total those up. So I take total sales is plus equal to sales. So basically we're going through each one of those columns. So starting at row 0, column 0, 1, 2, 3, row 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3. And then I basically go ahead and print out those total sales. So if I go ahead and run this, it's going to basically, so I'll say quarter 1 is 400, 500, 600, 700. Division 2, quarter 1 is, we'll say 200, 300, 400, and 500. And then the last division, again, each quarter, we'll say 100, 200, 300, and 400. So if we were to go through and add all those up, we would see that it would basically come up to 4,600. Okay, so pretty simplistic. So again, here's what we're displaying. I want to display div1 plus 1. Again, remember, it's what the element is showing is starting at 0. Well, what we want to display, we want to start with 1. So so that's what we have there. So not too bad. Not going to see a whole lot of two-dimensional arrays, I think, in the rest of this book, but just realize they're out there and basically how we can use them, and make sure you kind of remember the inner and outer loops and basically dealing with those things. Now, the next thing that we want to deal with is initializing a two-dimensional array and getting the length of a two-dimensional array. So let's go ahead and take a look at lengths. And we'll see right off the bat that here I created an integer array. It's going to be called numbers. I can see the two square brackets. That's basically a two-dimensional array. And you notice I've got an outer brace and an here and an outer brace there, and then I just got inner brace, inner brace, inner brace, inner brace, inner brace, inner brace. So think of this as row 1, or I should say row 0, row 1, and then row 2, and then we got column, 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 column. Okay, so that's kind of how you have to think about it. So, and then once we have those initialized, then we can basically kind of do the same thing. So here's my for loop. I can say system print out, columns on row, blah, 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 blah. So it looks as though creating an index initializes 0 while the index is less than the numbers dot length. Okay, so what is the length of this guy? Well, let's do this. I'm going to say sys_o, and I want to say numbers dot length. And I'm gonna just run this real quick. It says 3. Wow. I would think there'd be more than that. Well, again, think of the outer length. That's the main length. So how do we get the other lengths? Well, that's basically what we're saying here. Is we're saying the row, so I'm saying sys.print the number of columns in the row is numbers index dot length. So again, Right now, when we just use the one index, we're talking about one row at a time and how many items are in each one of those. So here we're saying the number of rows is 3, the number of columns in row 0 is 4, number of columns in row 1 is 4, number of columns in row 2 is 4. So when I basically say numbers.length, I'm talking about the outer, which is the rows. And then when I have to get into each individual row, I have to basically give, in this case, just one index. That's going to basically represent the row, and I say dot length, and it will then show how many columns are in that row. So that's basically how we do that. So that's, we can initialize and also get the length. We saw how we can total a two-dimensional array. We saw that. Summing the rows, summing the columns. So there in 462, 461, 462, they start talking about summing just the rows and summing just the columns. And there's some good examples there as well. Now, let's do this. Let's take a look at past a two-dimensional array. So here I have a void main. So it's basically a main. It's executable. And there are blank values. So again, I'm basically initializing a two-dimensional array. I've got 3 rows and looks like 4 columns in each row. And then I say show array numbers. So here's my numbers array. And then show, since it's italicized, I pretty much know that is a method. So if I come down here and go to the show array method, there I can see my int. And again, it better be declared the same exact way as it's declared up here. Okay, so it's my int with 2 empty square brackets and array. Again, I can call this anything I want. Doesn't have to have the same name. And then I basically have my inner, I should say my outer and my inner for next loop. So there's my outer loop and my inner loop. So again, this guy's dealing with the rows. This guy's dealing with the columns within each row. And then I basically, it looks like I'm just printing out, what the numeric value of each. So if we were to run this, it says here are the values in the array: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and the sum of the values is 78. So again, this guy is basically going through each row. This guy's going through each column. And then we basically grab the row. That's the first index of a two-dimensional array, and the second one as the second index of a two-dimensional array. So not too bad. Not too bad at all. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we will then continue on with, I'll discuss what's called ragged arrays. It'll make a little more sense when we get to that, but we'll see you in a bit.